from the All Indiana Podcast Network.
It's time for real conversation about the real issues that affect our communities.
Poverty, education, equality, and more.
This is Real Talk.
Real Talk with Reverend Charles Harrison.
Welcome to Real Talk on the All of Indiana Podcast Network. I am Reverend Charles Harrison, and on this episode, I will be interviewing Rick Snyder, President of the Fraternal Order of Police, 86, and we will be talking about the issues of the surge in violence in Indianapolis and our broken judicial system in the city. Stay tuned. Welcome back. This is Reverend Charles Harrison on Real Talk, and I am so honored today to have a good friend of mine, Rick Snyder, President of the FOP 86 here in Indianapolis, and we have been certainly working together over the last several years in raising the issue of the surge in violence in the city of Indianapolis, and certainly we have been focusing on several different things, and one has certainly been the issue with the broken judicial system in the city. So I would like to welcome my friend Rick. Rick, how you doing?
Doing good. Thanks for having us.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today on Real Talk with Reverend Charles Harrison. And I decided to do this podcast because I felt like, and rather than doing those 10-second, 15-second sound bites on the news, that I could really share and talk about some of the stuff I really believe and my opinions on some of the stuff, and it's somewhat uncensored. So that was one of the reasons why I wanted to do this podcast. But let's talk about really what's been happening in the city. Certainly over the last 7 years, we have certainly seen record levels of violence in the city, the highest in the history of Indianapolis, and certainly you have been very vocal on these issues. And let's kind of talk in general about what's kind of been going on and what your concern is and the perspective of law enforcement as we see these numbers continue to rise.
Yeah, well, good grief, we go back at least 15 years, I would say, in terms of working together. A lot of people don't realize that. They think we just suddenly found one another here in the last few years. But and the difference being is that it goes all the way back 15 years where we were working together with out in the neighborhoods, in the streets, me from the policing perspective and you from the faith community and from 10 Point, and standing alongside of us as we worked very diligently to take neighborhoods back for the folks, as I like to say, the folks behind the blinds, the folks that can't come out, that are intimidated, scared of crime and violence that's occurring right in their very neighborhood. And we took steps to figure out ways that we could proactively take those neighborhoods back. And we launched many years ago an effort that we called EPIC Community Policing, which was EPIC standing for Education, Prevention, Intervention, and Community Collaboration. And what we found, and you can attest to, is that when we take very deliberative steps on educating the public about what the challenges are that we face, working together to take preventative steps to prevent crime from occurring, and then collaborating as a community to do that, all being on the same page, there's very little need for intervention. But make no mistake, if those things don't work after we have worked together as a group, intervention is necessary, and intervention should occur with the support of the community. And we saw dramatic differences that occurred. People forget that, but we saw neighborhoods that were facing murders, non-fatal shootings, stabbings, other avenues of violence, see a reduction in those numbers by some up to 30%. And so what we have seen is there are tools at our disposal that do work, and unfortunately we've gotten away from those in Indianapolis.
Well, you know, I remember that neighborhood. We were in the Mapleton Fall Creek neighborhood.
That was one of them,
Yes, when we did that walk together, which is the neighborhood that I live in. What has happened? Because I know, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, we had a great emphasis on kind of the community law enforcement partnerships and trying to address the issue of crime and violence in neighborhoods all across the city of Indianapolis. And it really seemed to be very effective. We had a lot of community groups engaged, faith-based groups like 10 Point, churches like, Barnes United Methodist Church that I'm a pastor of. We were very engaged and working hand in hand with law enforcement in the city. It just feels like we have somewhat gotten away from that the last, 8 to 10 years.
Well, what has happened is, let's be blunt about it, is that leaders, specifically elected leaders, politicians in charge, have allowed politics and political agendas to infiltrate the work. And the problem is, and we keep saying politics has no role in policing. And when we say that, that isn't just towards police officers. What we mean is policing in general, in terms of separating those who are intentionally and knowingly committing acts of violence and criminal activity, depleting the quality of life of folks in the neighborhoods, separating them from that. And I always say this, what the difference is, I find, is when people find out what's your why, what's your motivation, where's your heart at in all this. What I keep trying to convey to folks is, at least for me and the folks that I represent, if we're truly called to do this job by God, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. Right. And we're called to do this, and we love God, something bigger than ourselves, and love our neighbor. It's because we love our neighbor that if they are on the wrong track and they're committing acts of violence and they're threatening or taking the lives of our neighbors, we have an obligation to intervene. We have an obligation to separate them and get them out of that environment, really to help the suspect, help the evildoer, right? We never wrestle with flesh and blood. Mm-hmm. It's a spiritual battle. It's a spirit of wickedness and evil. And what we are saying is that in doing that, today they could be the suspect, tomorrow they can be the victim.
Right.
And what we have seen tragically, is that we've had opportunities to intervene, but a system has been destabilized and deconstructed in a way that it allows for this revolving door to have been created. And now it's allowing for the revolving door to spin even faster. And then what we're finding is that the system, by design, is allowing repeat violent offenders to be cycled right back into our neighborhoods. And what happens when that occurs, Rev? You know this.
Right.
It destroys trust and respect of the good folks in the neighborhood that put their trust into the police by calling them to report the crime, to report the drug dealer on the corner or the person that had the gun on them or whatever the case may be. They view the police come in to make the arrest, but when that person comes right back out, quite often looking for retribution, the citizen perceives that as the police made the arrest and the police allowed them right back out of jail. Nothing can be further from the truth. And so in the last 3 years, you and I have really worked diligently since the fall of 2019 to bring attention to this. And you'll recall that came out of the downtown shooting.
Right.
That occurred in September of 2019. People forget, we do not, that we had 6 people shot in downtown Indianapolis in one incident, a mass shooting incident in downtown Indianapolis in which 6 people were shot, 3 of which were juveniles. I don't believe that still has been solved to this day.
No.
But we said that's enough. And we held a press conference on the very corner where that occurred.
Right.
And said that we need to make a change. And we started bringing attention to this. I think what caught, and I can't speak for you, but I think what caught both of us off guard was the response of the stakeholders, the decision makers involved in the criminal justice system. Not only did they say, hey, we're not going to work with you to make a change, they were very strong in their position of any idea of bringing stakeholders around a table to fix this was not going to happen. Their words, not ours.
Right.
And you got to see that.
Well, I did, and sadly, probably a little before that, in the work of 10 Point, that there was just resistance to really listen and to work with, 10 Point on trying to identify what some of the causes were that we were seeing on the street, but they totally ignored it. So by the time, we did that press conference in September, of 2019, after 6 people had gotten shot downtown, I think I was a little surprised by the response from the courts. Normally had been, City Hall and the elected officials around, in the city county council but I hadn't had, that kind of interaction with the courts. And I think I was in the room when we had the meeting. I was somewhat shocked at the response concerning that, and their reluctance to really work with us to address that issue.
Yeah, and really just emphatic that they were not going to do it. And I think, but I always say don't stop there, right? The bigger question then becomes, well, why? Why would folks within the system not want to work to improve the system? And invariably what we kept seeing is all roads led back to this very proactive, agenda-driven effort of quote-unquote criminal justice reform and bail reform. And I always tell people that on the surface, I don't think there's a lot of daylight between officers and the public in terms of what we see as deficiencies in the system and areas that we can improve. But I think the outcomes we're seeking are very different. We really come from a model of good, strong, proactive, preventative measures. I would much rather, I say this all the time, I would much rather as an officer make an arrest of somebody and have them mad at Rick, right? Mad at me for taking them to jail for a lower level crime, criminal allegation, then not intervening, and then they become the suspect or the victim of a much more serious act of violence, non-fatal shooting, stabbing, or even a homicide, a death. They take the life of someone or lose their life in an act of violence. I would much rather have them mad at me today than to see them in eternity and them asking me, why didn't you do more to help? Why didn't you do more to stop this? And I take that very seriously.
What do you think, during this time, it was, in 2019, it was kind of before what we would see later, the whole Black Lives Matter movement, when we had certain incidents with police. And some of the criticism that I have received is that I was promoting a racist system that was bent on locking up black people, and that I was a part of it. And my response was no. Our focus has been more on those who have been repeat violent offenders who are out in the streets reoffending. And when we go to the shooting scenes or homicide scenes, sadly, they're either the suspect that you hear may have done it or they're the victim, and that is playing a major role in, the increase in violence that we're seeing in our city. And from your perspective, what role do you think the Black Lives Matter movement played in what we were trying to do at the time when you had these 2 or 3 incidences across the country where all police got labeled as, a part of a racist system that was anti-black and was not working in the best interests of Black America?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we are quick to point out is facts matter.
Okay.
Right? And so we all have to start from a set of facts that people can agree upon. Now, that's very difficult to do sometimes, but I'll give you some examples. So if you go back and you look at context, we started talking about this in 2019. Politicians said we were exaggerating, we were making it up, we were belaboring the point. The problem is that we were seeing violence surge at a pace that we had never seen before in all of our years of working. We'd never seen it, and it was happening toward the end of 2019. You'll remember 2019 was a year where homicides dipped just a little bit. They went from 179 in 2018 to 171 in 2019. But the problem is that the numbers were surging at the end of the year going into the new year. But you'll remember politicians, again, leveraged that with an agenda at the beginning of 2020 and said, hey, folks, the numbers are moving in the right direction. Remember that?
Right, I remember that.
But we knew differently because we knew that, no, they were actually surging and spiking, overlapping the 2 years. And then, unfortunately, that proved to be the case. We went from 171 to 245 by the end of that next year, which really proved the point. And then the following year, 2021, we went from 245 to 271. What's that mean? It means that from the end of 2019, we were at 171 to the end of 2021, we were at 271, a 100 homicide increase, right? It was an increase of 59% in deaths. Why do I tell you all that? Well, in the intervening time, in May of 2020, most people think about the George Floyd incident, very rightfully so. We were quick to point out that, hey, there is a massive problem here, and there were a lot of things that could have been done differently, should have been done differently, and we talked very publicly about that. What people forget is specific to Indianapolis, we had another incident that had occurred just weeks prior that became quickly a very controversial incident of a use of force that turned into a deadly outcome related to a suspect who had taken force against an officer that could have resulted in death. And you'll recall that during those intervening weeks between that incident and the George Floyd incident, we went for weeks, days and weeks, where people were publicly in Indianapolis threatening to murder police officers and their families because of this first incident. And we kept saying, folks, you got to wait and get the facts here because they're very different than what was being portrayed. And on top of that, we found that the whole incident was really being hijacked by another agenda-driven group. Now, you use the name of a group. You'll very rarely even hear me use the name because what I've come to learn is it doesn't matter what the name is. As soon as that name gets tarnished with some kind of bad publicity or whatnot, it seems like you get another group that just takes the spot. The point is more about the philosophy. And the philosophy has really become demonstrated to deconstruct the very systems. Now, we can debate whether or not there's good reason for that or not. But the fact is that remains is there's a very clear objective to destabilize the systems. And then when the systems collapse, then those agenda-driven groups with, quite frankly, other agendas can step in to try to remake them. And that's why we say it's really a philosophy of if you break it, you can remake it. The problem is the facts get lost in the middle of that. Here's why that's also important. When these same groups tell us what lives matter, the only thing I say is, listen, we are talking about repeat violent offenders. And in Indianapolis, we see time and time again, 70 to 80% of our homicide victims are our fellow black neighbors. I ask the question, what about those lives? Do they not matter? And when we look into it and dig into it, we have seen public reports that have suggested as high as 40% of those deaths were involved someone who should have been, could have been held for a prior bad act. And had that occurred, that latest tragedy could not have occurred. Well, what's that mean? It means that they're preventable. And what we are saying is, why don't we all get around a table, all the relevant stakeholders, and say, take these real-world examples, work backward off of them, and just say, were there any opportunities for us to intervene? What part of this do we own? I'm saying that for police officers, too. And if we identify gaps in the system, now work collaboratively to fill those gaps so that we can prevent such an incident from happening again in the future. If that saves one life, I would suggest it's worth it. But what we know is it's going to save many more lives, at least 40%. And I think the community as a whole sees that, and I've been overwhelmed when the FOP has been overwhelmed, specifically by black folks in the neighborhoods calling us and saying, "Hey, these agenda-driven groups don't represent me. They don't represent what we believe, and we are tired of the violence and losing a generation of our youth." And so I think you're seeing very what people sometimes think are groups that wouldn't be in agreement, standing together, shoulder to shoulder, and saying we've got to do better.
Well, I agree with that, and you know what was frustrating. I remember when me and you went to see the governor, and you know the news came out by some reporter group within the Black Lives Matter movement, and I'll go ahead and say the name, that reported that we were advocating with the governor to lock up black people. And it was furthest from the truth about, you know, what the meeting was about. You know, my concern is not for the nonviolent offenders, but my concern is for what I see on the streets. And I talk from that perspective when I'm out with 10 Point. I know the number of people that I'm seeing on the streets, hanging out, still doing what they was doing prior to being arrested with the ankle monitors on, you know, and I'm wondering, you know, why they are still out in the street, hanging out, you know, on the street corners, at the store, still slinging, you know, and normally when there's something bad that happens in the neighborhood, one of those individuals tend to be involved, or their name is being mentioned, or they are the victim of that violent act.
Can I say something about that? Because that I think is going to be proven to be the key factor in all of this. And I think it's important, and I know that a lot of folks, when they actually hear the facts, they actually have more questions about what is going on. They say things like this. So when folks say, listen, we wanted to see a quote-unquote bail reform, I always say this, hey, I'm happy to engage on those discussions. And again, I don't know that we necessarily have much agreement, especially when we're talking about low-level first-time offenders. But that's not what we're dealing with here. We've seen that agenda, that effort to address that, to create low or no bonds for low-level first-time offenders, has really been bastardized into a way that it now is being utilized for repeat violent offenders as well, and it was never for that design. In 2020, this Indiana State Supreme Court issued what they called Criminal Rule 26, which provided the framework, the platform for local county courts to start trying to move away from a cash bail bond system. Most folks will tell me, FOP, cash bail bond systems disproportionately affect the poor and communities of color. They're always shocked when I respond and say, I don't really disagree with you, but so does violence. And so what we have pointed out is a reform on bail for low-level first-time offenders, non-violent offenders, is a rightful discussion and an avenue for us to pursue. But when it bleeds into repeat violent offenders who should not be getting out, where when you talk to the Indiana State Supreme Court, they'll tell you that's not the purpose of Criminal Rule 26. And if that's occurring like it is in Marion County, that is not the correct use of it. So what we are saying is, what we're finding instead is that judges are saying, hey, they know they shouldn't be releasing these folks who are repeat violent offenders, and I can prove it to you. They hedge their bets by putting them onto an electronic GPS monitoring system, because then they think, well, one, that might prevent them from doing something, and two, if they do, we might be able to track them. Here's the great underbelly that nobody talks about. So the same folks who talk about cash bail bond system disproportionately affecting the poor and communities of color, what they don't talk about is what happens once they get put onto a GPS monitoring system. Well, what gets happen is they are charged at a rate of $14 a day to be on that GPS monitor. People forget that, always say, who pays for that? Well, if you look at the documents, the offender has to sign a paper saying, I agree to pay the fee for this GPS monitoring. Well, who provides the GPS monitoring? It's not the government. It's not the city of Indianapolis. It is a for-profit, publicly traded company on the New York Stock Exchange. And they're making $14 a day. Indianapolis has more folks on GPS monitoring than any other city in the nation. That's pure raw numbers. That's not broken up by population or percentages. That's raw numbers. An average of 4,300 offenders a day on GPS monitoring. Do the math. 4,300 times $14 a day. How much is that a day? How much is that a month? How much is that a year? Well, what you quickly see is you're talking about millions upon millions of dollars that are involved. So rather than the money going to a bail bonds organization, it's just being redirected and siphoned to a for-profit company. We've taken very deliberate steps to move away from for-profit incarceration systems, for-profit privatized jails, privatized prisons, right? Right. All they did is they just shifted that to a privatized bracelet that they put on people to track them and charge them and to still pay for their freedom. So you'll have an offender that say they may have normally, under normal circumstances, they may have gotten a $2,000 bond that they would have had to pay. It was a $20,000 surety. They would have had to pay $2,000 through a bail bonds organization to get out, right? Well, you have these folks that say, no, because we care about poor people and we care about people of color, right? We are going to make that a flat $500 cash bond. See, doesn't that make us better than what we were doing? Right. Well, the rest of the story is now they're charging the offender $420 a month to be out awaiting trial. So what's that mean? Well, like the last 2 years, we've had very few trials occur. We have a backlog of over 35,000 trials that are waiting to be heard. Well, while those folks are out awaiting trial for all that time, they're paying $420 a month for their freedom. So oftentimes you'll see the offender pays way more than the $2,000 surety bond they would have paid. And instead that money is going, thousands upon thousands of dollars is going to a for-profit company.
The Fraternal Order of Police, Rick, and yourself did a press conference, and you really talked about what you believe are the solutions. And let's talk a little bit about, what you and the FOP believe, and a lot of, local patrol officers. I mean, I hear the same issues from district commanders, officers on the street. So what is, from your perspective, the solutions to addressing the broken judicial system here in Marion County and what we see in the surge in violence in the city?
Yeah, well, we just didn't point to problems. We pointed to solutions, right. And we put forward 7 solutions right out of the gate. The first one was just for our appointed and elected officials to say that they were outraged by the violence. We still have yet to hear many of them say that. The second component was really to form this Commission on Criminal Justice Outcomes. This was that stakeholder group to get them around a table, say, set the problems on the table, let's work backwards off of them and find solutions to fill those gaps. They publicly refused to do that. You'll recall there was even a vote on that in the Public Safety Committee of the Indianapolis City County Council, and on a partisan vote, it was rejected to form such a commission. Coincidentally, tragically, that night, right after the vote, there was a quadruple murder involving juveniles and young adults as victims.
I
remember that?
Yeah, I remember.
And then we were standing out there in the cold,
right,
talking about the failure of the system there. Now, we have also brought attention to this failed juvenile justice system in Marion County. People know this. We are all seeing juveniles specifically carrying handguns, firearms, at an amazing rate. You could have a group of juveniles, maybe 10, and out of 10, maybe 7 or 8 of them are armed at any given point in time. And people say, how is that occurring? We see juveniles being involved in carjackings, which are up over 40% in Indianapolis, the vast majority of which are suspects who are juveniles. Juveniles involved in armed robberies of businesses. We just saw 2 juveniles killed last week. I'm not saying those juveniles were involved in criminal activity. I'm just saying that we're seeing juveniles involved more as suspects in violence and also involved more as victims in violence. Why is that? Well, as we said all the way back in September of 2019, the adult criminals know that the criminal justice system is a joke here in the city. And so what they do is they hedge their bets and they put the guns in the hands of the juveniles because they know if they get arrested, nothing is going to happen to them. And worse yet, if the juvenile talks, they're easy prey and easy victims to eliminate them and take them out of the equation. So that's a huge factor. And then the other thing that we talked about was we have got to get a handle not just on the disproportionality rate involving African Americans, specifically ages 18 to 24, as being victims of homicides, but also the disproportionality of deaths involving infant, toddler, and child mortality rates. You don't hear anybody talking about that hardly in the state of Indiana. Right. And it's your police that are bringing attention to that, along with some other groups as well. But the point being is that all these issues are playing a role. And if you don't believe it, look at the surge in the number of female victims of homicides in the city. Just since 2018, we have seen a 127% increase in female victims of homicide.
One of the things I was talking to a couple community leaders a few days ago, and one of my observations being on the streets with the 10.0 Gs is the number of females that we see now involved in the drug game. And it has dramatically, in my opinion, increased from when I first started with 10 Point over 20 years ago. And the number of females carrying guns now openly.
That's right.
And we're so that is that a correlation between now the number of females we're seeing being shot and injured and shot and killed, in the city?
Could I make a suggestion on that? I think it absolutely is. Yes. And I think a lot of it goes to this. Typically, females as a whole will have a much lower level of criminal records than males as a whole, right?
Right.
So you're seeing the exact same thing. These guys that are in the game, that are slinging dope, that are also trafficking illegal guns and committing acts of violence, they're putting the guns into the hands of the females, the girlfriends, whatnot, to carry for them. Right? Because they know if they get arrested, nothing will happen to them because they probably don't have a very strong criminal record. At the same time, as part of this quote-unquote bail reform, we saw in Indianapolis that the city of Indianapolis moved a series of level 6 felonies to a flat $500 cash bond, which creates a revolving door, cycles folks back out. And our courts even said it's because these crimes do not involve violence. Can I cite the crimes again like we always do? It's felony battery, residential entry, criminal confinement, intimidation, resisting law enforcement, strangulation, escape, pointing a firearm, criminal gang activity, stalking, and criminal recklessness. Now, I always ask this question. It's a long list, but what crimes in there don't involve violence?
Right.
But those crimes in Indianapolis are getting a flat $500 cash bond. 3 of those are the major predictors for lethality in domestic violence cases. Mm-hmm. That's felony battery, strangulation, and stalking.
Right.
They get a $500 cash bond. The offender comes right back. Who do you think they're going and looking for?
Right.
And I would suggest to you that may be why you're seeing a 127% increase in homicide victims in females.
So was any of that addressed and dealt with in this last session at the State House that may change some of those laws?
Yeah, we worked very hard on that, and we had what was called a Marion County crime package. Okay. It really is state law that will affect every county, because here's the point, Rev, and you know this. If we don't stand the line here in Marion County, it will spread to other medium-sized cities throughout the state. And they're really just watching to see if we're going to push back or not. And I'm saying we as a community. Right. And they would be these politically motivated, agenda-driven groups that's intentionally trying to destabilize the system, to deconstruct and break it. And so what we saw was legislation that passed this session that addresses electronic monitoring. It addresses charitable bail organizations. Remember, we also found that there was a charitable bail organization that was receiving taxpayer money from the city of Indianapolis, and then it was later found out that they were involved in bailing out repeat violent offenders, right, who then went on to commit acts of homicide, murder, allegedly. Well, what you find is now you've got taxpayer-subsidized criminal offenders that are now taking the lives of fellow citizens. So state legislation was designed to address that. Now, again, we're not against charitable bail organizations. Right, we just said, hey, play by the same rules as other bail organizations, have the same regulations, and oh, by the way, let's not have you receiving taxpayer funds to do so.
You know, my concern with that, and as I've talked to other clergy, and certainly, you know, one of the particular groups has taken a shot at 10 Point in me. My concern was, what is the process if you're going to bail someone out who's a repeat violent offender? Because our understanding was the whole project was based on bailing out nonviolent offenders who didn't have much of a criminal record, you know.
That's the way it was advertised.
Yeah, that's the way it was advertised. So we were shocked and concerned when we were hearing the news stories and talking to people in law enforcement that was not the case.
Well, and remember, that organization said that's not the case. And then when we dug a little further, because we kept asking questions, they were also required by Marion County to submit quarterly reports of the cases they were bailing out, what the outcomes were. Well, then it was found out that they hadn't submitted their quarterly reports for almost 2 years. Wow. So then when we asked the question, at the beginning of 2022, the courts said we are no longer partnering with this group. And by March of this year, they are required to submit their reports and their outcomes. We're still waiting on those reports to be submitted or at least published.
Wow. What are some of your other solutions and observations for certainly this surge in violence that we are seeing? We're now in the 8th year. The homicide numbers are somewhat down. I think it's too early to really make an assessment on where we really are. We haven't gotten into the warm weather yet, but certainly there are some who are feeling a little confident, you know, in City Hall that maybe we have turned the corner. What is your assessment of kind of where we are right now?
We're getting ready to go off the cliff again, and we've been going off the cliff. So here's the key. The key is we've got to close the revolving door. We've got to hold people accountable and, quite frankly, put them in the penalty box if they have a demonstrated history of violence, prior convictions for violence. If they get rearrested for a new allegation, they shouldn't get right back out. They should be held, separated from society, and held until the system could identify what steps they need to take, including conviction and sentencing and all those other things. The second component to that is we've got to be very assertive about avoiding these sweetheart plea deals that we get from the Marion County prosecutor. Time and time again, we see that you'll have a suspect that's been arrested for an allegation of violence that includes a gun. And there's a gun charge in the series of charges that have been submitted. And time again, you'll see a plea agreement that gets offered by the prosecutor that dismisses the gun charges and gives little or no jail time. And then lo and behold, the suspect, the defendant in the case, says, yeah, I'll take that plea agreement. Well, why? Because they know they're not going to have to stay in jail. They're going to get back out. And they're getting the gun charges dismissed. Why is that important? Anybody who knows will tell you it's because they know that if they have that gun charge stuck on them as a conviction, if they get arrested again in the future for a crime, it enhances that crime. So the Marion County prosecutor is waiving these possible enhancements in the future, which really keeps our officers and the community with their hands tied behind their back while the offenders are running roughshod throughout the city. Right. And so we've got to get rid of that. And then finally, we have to have the judges address this issue of holding people without bond, or at least not lowering their bond. Rev, we've seen people, we had a suspect that was alleged to have stabbed somebody in the face. I think we can agree that's a violent allegation of violence.
Certainly.
Had a $30,000 bond, okay, which would be commiserate with the crime that is alleged. But for some unknown reason that's inexplicable, a judge made the decision to lower that bond from $30,000 to $750. The person bonds out, by the way, through a charitable bail organization, and then is alleged to have gone on and dismembered a female. Now, we have another female victim of homicide, and I think we can agree cutting a body up is a pretty violent action, right?
Certainly.
Not making light of it. I'm just saying
certainly.
These are the examples that are happening. Well, what we hear is people say, well, that's just a one-off. That's a real exaggerated case. But the problem is we put case after case after case on the tables. And at some point in time, we're going to reach a critical mass where people are going to have to agree that something has to be done. I think you're seeing it at the State House. I can tell you we're hearing it in the neighborhoods. But it's still these agenda-driven groups that are trying to publicly oppose it. And I think once the community says enough is enough and rises up and says we're not taking this anymore, you'll see the politicians respond. But in the interim, we have to have engagement specifically from our faith community to stand up and say, what happened to the sanctity of life? Where are the voices when children are being slaughtered in our community? We just had a 14 and 15-year-old killed, but as you know, we've had 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds, babies being killed in acts of violence. And you hear very little, if any, public response. And so I think we've got to return to faith. We've got to call upon God to help us and to heal our land. And we have to stay focused. And when I say we, I mean you, I mean me, I mean other folks who do place a sanctity on life. It reminds me, you and I have talked about this, but in the book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah comes back, he's building the wall for the city, remember?
Right.
And you had two folks, Sanballat and Geshem, that came and sent messengers trying to distract Nehemiah. They conspired to distract him and bring him off of that wall so he couldn't take the city back, basically, and give it back to the residents. And I just want to quote this. You remember what Nehemiah says in Nehemiah chapter 6? It's actually verse 3. He says, I am doing a great work, and I cannot come down. Remember this?
Yes,
and he says, why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you? That is my encouragement, not just to you, but others, leaders in the community, not just in the faith community, but in other avenues, but especially in law enforcement as well. We have to stay focused, we have to remain united, and we have to take our city back.
Well, Rick, thank you so much. This has been a real great conversation that we have had today. And thank you so much for joining me today on Real Talk. We're going to be talking soon because I know there's a lot more that we didn't cover today. Thank you for joining me. I'm Reverend Charles Harrison, and this has been Real Talk. Join me next time as I bring you more real talk about the real issues that affect our community here in Indianapolis and across the country. And I pray that you have a blessed and a wonderful day.
This is Real Talk with Reverend Charles Harrison.
Be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast.
And be sure to check out other great podcasts on the All Indiana Podcast Network.
Online now at allindianapodcast.com.